World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel. This is program number 530, and it's January 31st, 1982. I have a suspicion that a couple of gentlemen from the Secret Service or a few more officials of the government might be listening this evening, and many of them probably never listen to this program. So welcome as a World Watcher, and we'll get on with the program, and a lot of this first part will be addressed to you and what I think about our meeting this evening or this afternoon at my home. George Bush was on the peninsula, Vice President Bush, and he was addressing the Republican convention in Monterey this weekend, January the 30th, yesterday, and there were various people out in front of the hotel protesting. A silent group of people met with posters, the American Civil Liberties Union, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, now the Women's Action, the Action for Democratic Action, Americans for Democratic Action, the International League for Peace and Freedom. They're quite a large group, a coalition of organizations that met out in front, holding signs and protesting the policies of Ronald Reagan towards unemployed, the women, the poor, the elderly, and the nuclear policies, and so forth. At first, I was going to be out in front of the hotel and thought I would join the group, and then I realized it is more valuable for my time to be inside, talking to the Republicans and seeing what's going on and meeting the various people running for state offices, if possible, or going to the tables where their co-workers were working. And I typed up a page on the Republican Party and my position on George Bush because he was their guest speaker and he's our vice president. And it consists of 10 sentences, and I had several hundred of these made, and another friend made a couple hundred, and we passed them around. I talked to people at various desks and talked inside about this situation. And what I had on the sheet was my stationary World Watchers International, the CIA, George Bush, and political assassinations. No president or vice president of the United States should have been working for the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, or the Defense Industry Security Command. These are the sentences that I have on the sheets that I distributed and left around the table, and they got in the hands of the Secret Service. I gave one to Marine Reagan, and she was there. The Constitution of the United States made no provision for the Central Intelligence Agency or the National Security Council, and that is a fact. They have taken away the balance of power. Second sentence, General Reinhard Gehlen, Adolf Hitler's chief of intelligence, was flown to the Pentagon 5 months after World War II ceased. Gehlen was hired by the USA to form our national security agencies identical to Hitler's Gestapo. U.S. training of torture and police for poor nations were methods used and approved by Gehlen for the Central Intelligence Agency. Gehlen was only in 2 cities in the United States, incidentally, Washington, D.C., and then he was flown to the Presidio out here in Monterey. It's about 1 block away from where this hotel was built for the convention. The convention was at that hotel. Sentence 3, the CIA has been working directly with Gestapo agents for the sole purpose of World War III against the Soviet Union, for mass slavery and economic profits, and mass genocide for the containers to be vaporized. Those are quotes from the Defense Department memo on blacks called the King Alfred Plan. Sentence 4, the CIA Director George Bush from 1976 to 1977, that was when he was CIA Director, knew in advance and covered up the murder of Chilean Ambassador Orlando Letelier and Sandra Moffit September 18th, 1976, when they were blown up in Washington, D.C. I didn't have space on this paper to say that Mr. Contreras, who worked with Hitler, was a Nazi from Chile, has been rearrested in Chile just this last week. He was in touch with General Vernon Walters and the CIA, and they decided to rearrest him. I guess he was part of the Chilean intelligence, and now they are taking some responsibility for the murder of Letelier that was very much involved in Washington. Sentence 5, CIA Director George Bush, now Vice President Bush, entertained H. Mubarak in his home 2 days before Anwar Sadat was murdered. The CIA knew in advance of the murder plans and that Mubarak would become president of Egypt within 2 days. And I did a few broadcasts on the murder of Anwar Sadat and the way that Mubarak and the Defense Department, the procurement of the weapons for the Egyptian military and the intelligence were against Sadat and arming the PLO simultaneously. And he was betrayed. And headlines right after the murder of Sadat stated in all the major papers the CIA knew in advance he would be killed. Bush was director of the CIA, and with that position, you really don't go very far away from it once you've been the director of it. And 2 days after the luncheon at his home, Mubarak was president of Egypt. Next sentence, CIA Director George Bush worked directly with or supplied weapons for murder and torture to the CIA assassination team of Edwin Wilson, Frank Turple, George Corkle, and Theodore Shackley. There is never proof that they ever left the CIA. Their expertise was to arm Idi Amin, Gaddafi, and Carlos with weapons, training, supplies for death. And on the sheet I put the address for the Frank Turple interview where William Colby admits that even if they were ex-CIA, they could still be in the CIA. And this was the time period when George Bush was director of the CIA that Frank Turple was talking about the torture house and the equipment. We sent millions of dollars, I think $3.2 million, to Idi Amin. Turple worked on the third floor, and the screaming and the bloody cutting up of people was down below. 7, CIA Director George Bush headed and once had to control, as head of the CIA, the Australian Guggenheim Bank. The bank collapsed when Frank Newman was murdered. 14 other deaths followed immediately. London Times described the affair as the bank, CIA, heroin, and murder. That was 1980, the London Times top story. $55 million to $1 billion CIA dollars are still missing. While George Bush was heading the CIA, they were heavily involved in Southeast Asian narcotic traffic and drug wars. And I didn't have time on the sheet to go into Air America and the narcotics and the traffic from Southeast Asia to the Guggenheim Bank in Australia and disseminated among people that were in the hands of George Bush when he was the director of the CIA. Next sentence, the new CIA purge after Watergate that claimed credit for more than 1,000 assassinations in the 70s alone. George Bush at that time had to be covering up or directing the bombings, kidnappings, drug traffic industry. 9, John Hinckley Jr.'s near bullet to the President Ronald Reagan's heart is so closely related to the CIA and George Bush affiliations in Texas and oil industry that Hinckley has not been faced, he has not had a trial. Hinckley Jr. has been identified with the American Nazi Party as well as international connections to Mohammed Ajah, the man who shot the Pope, and Frank Turple, and the assassination attempts on these people. They're linked together, and Hinckley has been arrested for the shooting in Washington but hasn't had his trial yet. And in conclusion, every unpunished political assassination makes the killer team more powerful over your lives. Human rights, civil rights, nuclear freeze become impossible if Gestapo agents have future plans for you. And I concluded with one more sentence. The only path to peace is by studying the past and how we got to this place on the brink of nuclear war, mass hunger, and mass genocide. I gave one of these, as I say, to the Reagan, to Ronald Reagan's daughter, who wants to run as a senator in this state, and put one of the sheets in her hand and talked to her, and the Secret Service were around her. Well, there was a Secret Service agent at my home in June to discuss the Hinckley affair and whether or not he was at my house. John Hinckley was at my house in January, and was that the same person who shot the president in March of 1981? Mostly they come to find out. They ask me again my driver's license, my social security number, the names of my family members. Can they take my picture? Can they get psychiatric records? I have permission. Could they have if I went to a psychiatrist, or my medical records? What's my maiden name? Where's my ex-husband? All the questions. They fill out a report. They come to the house and fill out all the reports on me, and they don't spend the time investigating the Hinckley family or the shooting of people in this country that's covered up so cleverly, going back to the years I began studying the Kennedy assassination, then realized all the different ways to cover these up. Could they take my picture? Very friendly. This one fellow had been at my house before, and he's nice enough. They're very uptight. I said, would you like to see a picture of the man at the window leaning down on the balcony behind Hinckley where Ronald Reagan was shot? I said, oh, yeah, but they left. They come in and talk as if they have about 2 minutes to write a report on something, and it's as if the car motor were running and they had to be out there and get back to someplace within a time limit. The curiosity level never goes beyond, well, let's see the picture of a guy. Do you have a picture of a man in the crowd, up on the balcony? The researchers who study these cases and years later are proven correct, in spite of all the official government people who get a salary to do this. The researchers keep finding information that the others don't want to see, and they turn their back on it and are not supposed to see it. And then, as I say, years later, there's the Senate Watergate Committee investigating things we said a long time before about the mind control and the medical experiments and opening people's homes and opening their mail, and the Reagans Committee, the Rockefeller Committee, the Senator Church Committee, and the House Select Committee on Assassinations. There's always new information coming out, and it's coming from the curious people who want to know what's going on in this country. It's not coming from the FBI and the Secret Service. That's what they're paid to do, is to find the problems and write them up and prevent them in the future. But the events keep taking place over and over again because the people in charge of looking into the matter brush it over, by trying to collect information on me, which they already have. And I'm not the problem. I assured them I'm really not the problem. The problem is out there, but it's very hard to get in their heads. They've been trained a certain way, and it's hard to get into their heads. They want to know if I dislike George Bush. I don't dislike George Bush. Do I hate Bush? I don't hate Bush at all. I just don't like the Savak. I don't like the Gestapo. I don't like Chile's DINA. I don't like the KGB. I don't like the CIA because I don't think they're there to gather information. I think they make trouble for the multinationals in order to keep the native slaves and keep the profits in the hands of a few corporations. The CIA is a private army for the sole purpose of instigating problems so we can send troops, and then we have a handle on the minerals or the agriculture or the oil in those native populations. We create the problem to send our people there so that the corporations who have the investments will realize the maximum of their investments. That's what they're there for. They have nothing to do with telling us in advance of any situation that's going to happen or has happened. They have missed every major incident and been off the beaten path on many of them. And events that do take place, they're caught by surprise, whether it's a martial law in Poland or the military coup when Khomeini took it and the Shah was out. They miss all these points that do happen, and they spread rumors where they wouldn't happen otherwise. I don't hate anybody, but I have no sympathy for these people causing so much trouble and pain. And if you saw the NBC News this week, or CBS it was, I missed the segment this evening, saw the night before last of what's going down in El Salvador and going in like the Phoenix program in Southeast Asia and pulling women and children out and killing them and making them go down the river to Honduras, and young boys with guns, shooting at people for no reason at all. I'm glad when I see those things that I'm at least trying to do something and point out where these people got the nerve and the right. They think it's the legal right to go in and shoot anybody they want. The system that was set up by the Gestapo gives them the right, so there's every legal loophole, and that's why our Army is training now in North Carolina some more secret teams to go into El Salvador to kill some more of the population. I can't stand that kind of thing, and that's why I speak up, because I hate that kind of violence and exploitation. And our agencies have it, and our past directors of the CIA, Richard Helms, was removed because of perjury, and Alan Dulles said under oath that he would lie to protect the agency. He would lie under oath. He told that to the Warren Commission. So they're trained to lie. So I don't think that a vice president should become the president or even be sitting in that position, because by nature of his office and the agency, they are trained to be sneaks and lies and wear wigs and mouthpieces to disguise their voice. and do every kind of deceitful thing that they can. And I don't think a president who belongs to the organization who vow that they'll lie if necessary, there's a conflict there. A lot of people used to be afraid of a Catholic president, the conflict of the church and state, and that his allegiance would be to the Vatican. Well, a CIA vice president, a CIA president-to-be, would lie to the country because that's the nature of the job. They're trained to deceive for a particular goal, and the end is what they want, not the means. They're not careful about the means, and that's the way it goes. So we had a little visit. I imagine they'll be back again, but instead of standing on the street with signs, I just put on my curb button and went around and talked to the various delegates and told them, I gave away those Nazi buttons I had, stamp out the Nazis, and tried to explain that the Republican Party had to get the Nazis out of the party, such as Fritz Kramer in the Pentagon, who controls Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger. And then I get the usual, well, isn't Henry Kissinger a Jew? Well, there's Jewish Nazis, too, so that's okay. As a matter of fact, I brought in several articles from the New York Times, February the 16th, 1943, Jews for sale from Germany and Hungary for $50. That included all transportation expenses. If you put up $50, you could save a Jew. And the article was an ad signed by Ben Hecht in the New York Times. This is 39 years ago. And he said 2 million people have died, and they've sworn they're going to kill more. Help prevent 4 million people from becoming ghosts. A full-page ad written by Ben Hecht, New York Times, Friday, November the 5th, 1943, page 14. You can look it up and copy it. Emergency Committee to Save Jewish People. Well, 4 million did die, and the Jews didn't put up $50. My family didn't put up $50. I don't know anyone who did. As a matter of fact, one of the men on the committee, his name Rabbi Philip Bookstaber, I met him and he befriended us when my husband was in the Army, and we lived in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I knew Bookstaber 1944, 1945. He never even discussed the war or what was going on. This was before the atomic bomb had fallen, the same year, 2 months before it fell. He was working to save Jews a few years before. He was a rabbi. That wasn't even discussed at the dinner table or anything about the war of the Nazis. The circle I was in didn't even discuss these kinds of things. It was so far removed. So you can't blame the Nazis alone for the 6 million that died. The Jewish circle that I was part of, and they were wealthy Jews or comfortable Jews, never even thought about putting up $50 to send a Jew to Palestine. And they could. That included transportation and everything, and a Jew wasn't worth that much to them. And now they've made a profession of crying about the Holocaust, but that's another story. I shouldn't be so harsh about profession, but a lot of people keep writing books and stories and articles about the Holocaust. Why don't they go back to 1943 and find out why the American Jewry, each family didn't put up $50 to save one life? There was an article this week in the Examiner, February 2nd, 1982. The Pope's cousin, John Watola, lives in Detroit. He's furious because there was a plot to kill Pope John Paul II. He talks to his cousin, and they won't tell who did it. They say the person who was arrested had a lot of money, he had mobility, and this article tries to intimate that Gaddafi is the only logical person. He blames Gaddafi because Libya has terrorism, and the Italian government used to run Libya before Gaddafi was in. And the logic of why it would be Gaddafi is very weak, because Ajah wasn't just with Gaddafi. He was in Frankfurt, Germany. He married in Germany. He was in Spain before he shot the Pope. They knew about him in England. Frank Turple did say on television their role, his team that worked for the CIA, training Ajah for shooting, and that he belonged to the fascist werewolves that I talked about several weeks ago. The reason there's silence, the cousin of the Pope can't figure out why there's silence, is that if you really go to who was behind it, you end up again with the CIA, the same people that shot Sadat, Anwar Sadat, that tried to shoot Ronald Reagan and to shoot the Pope. And the reason all of these trials are in a standstill, even though they admit in Rome there's a conspiracy, the Pope can't get the truth out because either he's protecting somebody or they wouldn't dare tell him, and they are protecting the would-be assassins. So the relatives and friends and family can scream and yell, but the lid is on it, because if they went to who was behind the man who shot the Pope, they would go then to Licio Gelli with his dual citizenship in Argentina and the international network of fascists. And God forbid they uncover that, we'd be home free with almost a safe society. So they can't dare come to that conclusion. It'll take a little while and more people to figure out what's going on. And they'll keep asking questions. Well, why don't we find out where this conspiracy was? They can't find out because they're not asking the right questions. I spoke last week, just briefly, several times, on the trial in Rhode Island of Klaus Von Bulow. That's the fellow who's been charged with giving insulin and injections to his wife, nicknamed Sonny. She's in a coma. There were several articles in the newspaper that were of interest on that case this week. I mentioned last week how the jury was handpicked with 4 current or past employees of the Navy underwater system, and I thought that was kind of interesting, and said that trial is blown by the nature of the admiral and the 4 people from the Defense Department and Navy intelligence on the jury. But after last week's program, there was an article in the New York Times on this case on a telephone survey preceded the selection for the jury. Not only did he get his admiral and his 4 people from the same Defense Industry Security Command, that area of the intelligence system, but there's a company called Market Research in New Jersey, probably the home headquarters of IG Farben in New Jersey. A lot of New Jersey is coming into the news recently, if you've noticed. Market Research of New Jersey was hired by Von Bulow, and they made over 100 telephone calls, and they asked people, are you a registered voter? Do you own your own home? Do you have an opinion on Klaus Von Bulow? Have you formed your opinion yet? And they wanted to know what kind of economic class felt, do you think he's guilty or innocent? So this is the first time I've ever read where opinion poll of marketing research from New Jersey was brought in on the basis of how they would select or want a jury. And he has unlimited money, so the justice system works a little differently for the very rich than the very poor, I'm sure. And that maybe that's how they came to the decision they take the military people for the jury. Another interesting article in the Washington Post on the background of Von Bulow, this interesting character. I won't have to go too much into her background. She was married previously and then divorced. And in 1964 and in 1965, Sonny was in London, and she met Sonny Von Bulow, who was a Dane, and they got married in 1966. And this Klaus Von Bulow that Sonny met was a person who took on the name Von. There was no Von in his family. His father's name was Svend, S-V-E-N-D, Borberg, and he was put in jail for 4 years, the father, as being a Nazi war criminal, and the sentence was reduced for a while, and he was a Nazi. And Bulow was his mother's name when she remarried, and the family was prominent in Denmark. So after the father was the Nazi criminal, I suppose he changed his name to Borberg. Fritz Bulow was the new grandfather that he had after his mother remarried, and the name was prominent. And he added the Von, and according to the Washington Post, they don't know where he got that Von along the way. He threw that in. But Klaus Von Bulow became an aide and worked for John Paul Getty. He was a lawyer in London, then a top aide to Getty, and a lot of his work required extensive traveling. He went all over the world. This reminds me when he was working for Getty, and I did other radio programs on Otto von Bolschwing, and John Paul Getty von Bolschwing working for the Gehlen operation. Reinhard Gehlen, the chief of Hitler's intelligence again, Otto von Bolschwing took over the Gehlen operation and worked for Getty, and he became the head of the board of directors of TCI, a corporation out here in California, in Sacramento, and in Sunnyvale, California. And Otto von Bolschwing became the president in 1970 of that organization, and John Paul Getty was on the board, and this began a lot of travels in Europe that made introductions for Otto von Bolschwing, not that he needed more, but the board members involved the ITT, the past president of ITT, the former vice president of Fairchild, and contacts with Aristotle Onassis, and John Paul Getty. So Von Bulow worked for John Paul Getty, and the years overlap. At the time that he was working for him and traveling, Otto von Bolschwing was over in Europe and around the world also working for John Paul Getty. So this man has a background of Nazi family in World War II, and then after the war traveling in the same corporate structure as these other people. I don't know, as I said, the article doesn't say where he picked up the name Von and wanted it. George DeMohrenschildt, who worked with Lee Harvey Oswald, that came in through the Galen operation to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, he changed it to George de Mohrenschildt to make it sound French because the name was Von Mohrenschildt, and it sounded too German. He thought he wouldn't be accepted as a liberal, I guess, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He had to give it that little French extra touch to impress people, to lose the German intonations, because he was a German spy during World War II, and the FBI had followed him at that time. Now I'm going to change to another good article. It's in the San Jose Mercury this week. It's Accounting Time for the Reagans by Maxwell Glenn and Cody Shearer. And this article is about the Fred Fielding, the former assistant to the White House under John Dean, is now the attorney, the lawyer for Nancy and Ronald Reagan. And in 1978, the Ethics Committee in the Government Act, said that the president would have to disclose gifts worth more than $35 that they received in 1981 and loans or liabilities over $10,000. And the article says it's now accounting time for the Reagans. If she's donating these clothes to museums, and you know she borrowed jewelry up to $1 million to go to Prince Charles' wedding, and they have been receiving all kinds of sports clothes and clothes or gifts. A gift came to Ronald Reagan by the president of Mexico the day before the inauguration, so he didn't have to give that back. I believe it was a horse that was given to him. But now it's accounting time for the Reagans. But the interesting thing about this article, because the question of the gifts and the loans and where one leaves off, is that Fred Fielding is the attorney in the White House, the attorney for the Reagans. He's from Philadelphia. He was selected by John Dean to work in the White House for Richard Nixon, rather, at the time of Watergate. He was from Army Intelligence. He's a Philadelphia lawyer. I think of some other Philadelphia CIA people, Grace Kelly, that went on to Monaco, who is working with a lot of people very much involved in activities now that I've been discussing the last programs for the last months. Samuel Cummings of the CIA, who moved to London to supply weapons for people such as Carlos and Wilson and Turple. Richard Sprague, who was supposed to investigate the John Kennedy assassination, from Philadelphia. Arlen Specter is now a senator who is on the Warren Commission, and Jean Harris from Philadelphia. She was the woman involved with Dr. Tarnower, and there's a lot of activity in the Philadelphia area in the last few months. Philadelphia and New Jersey, just in the last, I'd say not more than months, maybe in the last year, people's backgrounds from Philadelphia, and interestingly placed because I'd done one radio program on the Philadelphia connections to the Kennedy assassination. There were 10 or 20 different people right from Philadelphia. Well, this Fred Fielding has the job of preparing the gift list about the Reagans, and that is sort of like the fox really guarding the chicken house to give Fred Fielding that job. You might remember several weeks ago when I was talking about the mysterious apartments of Richard Allen, that Fred Fielding owns a condominium in Florida with Richard Allen, and each one of them were friends and didn't tell for their confirmation hearings that they shared these apartments with each other. Fielding worked with Ronald Reagan and didn't say that he owned an apartment with Richard Allen from the National Security Council. Allen went to work for Reagan and didn't say that Fred Fielding was his partner in Florida in this condominium. And this condominium was purchased in 1976 near Fort Myers from Viscount Butello, a businessman from the Azores who worked with financier Robert Vesco. They wanted to start an international business district in the Azores on behalf of Robert Vesco. Now, I was very suspicious of the gifts that Nancy Reagan could receive, or the under-the-table money, the possibility that so much could be payoff and not revealed, because when you get Robert Vesco and Mr. Butello and Richard Allen and then Fred Fielding, the attorney for the Reagans, there's a whole pipeline or a train. I'm sure that Fred Fielding, with his past reputation at Watergate, isn't so accountable for anything or at all that would go in and out of the White House. Now, there are 3 apartments down there in Florida at the Sanibel Island. One Richard Allen owns, the other Richard Allen and Fred Fielding owns, and the Los Angeles Times printed an article in November 28, 1981. Richard Allen's third partner is still unnamed. Now, I should think it would be mandatory not only to switch his job from National Security Advisor to advisor to the White House, but to know who he shares it with. Does he share it with Theodore Shackley or Edwin Wilson or Robert Vesco? Who is there in that apartment? And remember the LA Times story, January 18th, 1981. I mentioned on broadcast number 522, that's 8 weeks ago, the Japanese newspaper said that the real gift, the present that Richard Allen got, is the big story behind the scandal. I'll take a break for 1 minute and get back to the Reagans' gifts and Richard Allen in 1 minute.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae. Now here's Mae with part 2.
Okay, it's very important to know, as I say, that Los Angeles Times had an article on these condominiums down there that the president and the FBI or the Congress that approve of these people don't know that the attorney for Richard Nixon, the deputy attorney for Richard Nixon under John Dean, becomes the attorney for Nancy and Ronald Reagan, and that he in turn shares an apartment with the National Security Advisor down in Florida, who has been involved with the Lockheed scandal, with payoffs over there. His name was involved with the Lockheed scandal. His name was involved with Robert Vesco at the height of Watergate and the ITT scandal, that he has an apartment in an area that was bought from a man, Mr. Butello, who was working in the Azores with Robert Vesco, and that the Japanese newspapers know that some other big present was transacted through Richard Allen. Now, do these presents go from Richard Allen to Nancy Reagan, or I'm sure they just don't go to Allen? So who is the man in charge of the accounting of what goes in and out of the Reagan's house, what they borrow, and what gifts they get? It's the Fox, it's Fred Fielding. Now, he was the person at time of Watergate that was in charge of the most sensitive papers of Watergate. He was the person in charge of E. Howard Hunt's desk, the Chappaquiddick papers, the forging of papers blaming John Kennedy for murdering DM in Southeast Asia, the papers of Dr. Lewis Fielding's office, the Ellsberg papers, all the dirty tricks, the Chappaquiddick. They were in charge of Chappaquiddick, and this kind of sensitive, dirty trick that involved murder. There was DM murdered, Mary Jo Kopechne murdered, John Kennedy murdered. And then the ITT scandal, they were obviously into the dirtiest areas of espionage. And Fred Fielding and John Dean were the ones who suggested deep sixing the material, pouring it into the river, emptying out the desk of E. Howard Hunt, and just leaving a few innocuous papers around. Even at the time of the ITT scandal, when there were things that John Mitchell and Robert Mardian didn't know, the Attorney General and head of the Justice Department, John Dean and Fred Fielding knew and destroyed. They shredded, they tore up, they sunk, they burned things, top papers that would overthrow the people in power today and expose the corruption in this country to the highest level. These are the things that, if the agents of the Secret Service are listening to tonight, that I really resent and get very angry about, that certain people who had access to those very top secret documents go on then to be accountable for what's going on in the White House today after destroying material in the criminal case where there was actually burglaries and taking away our democratic process in those offices. Now, there was another important article this week that had to do with a war with Syria that the United States wanted to have 6 months ago, and I'll get to that in a minute. But part of the article goes on to say that the State Department is so messed up, the National Security Council is the poorest and least effective in the last quarter of a century, that they had to get rid of Richard Allen. But it says Allen was forced out not because he accepted $1,000 for a Japanese magazine for setting up an interview with Nancy Reagan, but because he was an ineffective administrator who put together the national security staff. Now, the very fact that there is in print today that it had nothing to do with the money and the photograph of Nancy Reagan is the first time I've seen in print that, because I know that is the truth. That little envelope that said 1,000 or 100,000 was just a little bit of a tip of a huge scandal. The story of this one is that the Pentagon now has option papers drawn up by the National Security Council that the White House wanted a war with Syria last spring. I knew when Sadat was murdered that they could achieve a lot of things at one time. We could get all our troops into the Middle East immediately. We're going to pour into there, sell the AWACS to Saudi Arabia, introduce Arafat to Japan and make him a statesman for the first time recognized by the free world, scare everybody that Gaddafi could have been behind this, and get our army and troops out there any way we could in the Middle East. It didn't work. Our allies didn't go for it, and we went against it. But the second point about the plans to make the war and to bomb Syria and begin a war is that if they used our airplanes, United States airplanes, it would be considered a unilateral act of war. So what they were going to do was to use Israel and give them the green light to wipe out the Syrian missiles, and that would begin World War III. Can you imagine the National Security Council is going to give the Jews the opportunity to start World War III? I knew when they bombed Iraq or the missile planes there that they didn't do a thing without the advice of the United States. A small country like Israel wouldn't dare do it unless they're told to do it. And we're trying to get a response from these people so we have an excuse to get into that Persian Gulf. But Israel would be given the green light under the table. This was part of the agreement. And it says one of the men in the National Security Council from Indiana University, this Raymond Tanter, is considered strongly, even passionately pro-Israeli. So he loves Israel so much that they'll say, you go ahead and start it, and then we'll come in later. So the war with Syria was proposed last spring, and all that brahu about a possible war in the Middle East could have developed into a real war in the Middle East. Now, to update you on the Pan Am flight, the competition between Man American and Air America, and a little bit more last week, 1/2 hour, I did a analysis of what I thought were the important points of the airplane that went into the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. On the sheet from the broadcast, for those of you who get the tapes, I put in there possible motive for all major airlines, the East and the South, are losing competition to Air Florida. The Pan Am is going broke. I said, see, Edward Acker, who built Air Florida, left in September for Pan America. Pan America and major airlines didn't like the competition of this very successful Air Florida. Well, just this week in the newspaper, this is January the 30th, yesterday, Pan Am reports a net loss of $18.8 million. I didn't have the figures. Pan American World Airways said yesterday they had their $18 million loss, and they announced a 6% cut in their staff and management. 5 of the present 32 presidents will be downgraded. 1 vice president is going to be dismissed. 200 management people will be fired. 3,200 people in all will be fired. Chairman C. Edward Acker said the working day for remaining managerial employees will be 10 hours, up to 10 hours a day, and their vacation time will be halved to fill in the gaps. So Pan Am is under a loss, and the person that I mentioned who made Air Florida so successful, C. Edward Acker, moved to Pan Am, and they are in deep trouble. Old Melvin Belli opened his offices here in Monterey, and I think I mentioned before he was going to do that. He has offices in Los Angeles and San Francisco. He was on the evening news interviewed, and they asked him a question about John Kennedy's assassination because Belli represented Jack Ruby in that trial, and he said, oh, the Secret Service was lax, and so the fellow just happened to get there and get his shot, still holding the Oswald story. It'd be awfully nice, being as Melvin Belli will be in the community sometimes, and Mae Brussell is here, to have a debate, maybe at the Sunset Theater or at MPC, and have Melvin Belli defend the Warren Commission and Jack Ruby in his position as his attorney, and let me publicly debate with Melvin Belli. I have a feeling the city is just almost too small for Mae Brussell and Melvin Belli. I would just love to have a quiet discussion, not a newspaper media thing that he has, on the evidence of the conspiracy and the role of Jack Ruby with organized crime and with the military and the Genovese family and the CIA and the links of Ruby to the higher conspiracy. Well, Melvin Belli is going to represent as many of the people who want to sue and break the back of Air Florida as he can. He evidently somebody from his office placed an ad. This is in the San Francisco Examiner. Belli, whose East Coast representative, placed an ad in the Washington Post last week seeking clients among families of the victims of the airplane crash, the Air Florida 90. Melvin Belli promises to sue everybody who's even remotely responsible for the crash, and he'll ask large sums, and he wants to represent those people. Now, there were a lot of military people on that plane, and I've gone over the list of some of them, and I'm sure there must be with them intelligence or CIA. Belli had to be with the CIA to represent Jack Ruby because all the Warren Commission and staff and people around the assassination were in the intelligence community. So he's going to build a large suit on the fact of the air solvent on the wings, and he's taking the position that the ice and the solvent wasn't sufficient to let the plane get off the ground. He's going to get as many people, as many cases, and wrap that up into a big case, and it's a very controversial one. The same week after the accident, there was an article on the conflict of the Army and the Rapid Deployment Forces. Large article. The Army rivalry cost the United States a lot of money in national security. One in the Washington Post, one in the San Jose Mercury. The Army and the Marines go to war. And this article is about the fact that all four services of the military are angry at the Rapid Deployment Force. They fought 2 years to control the Rapid Deployment Force, the Army and the Marines, and they want high priority primarily to protect the Persian Gulf oil supplies. And this is about a fight of the Army services among each other against the Special Command Forces and the Rapid Deployment. Well, on that particular airplane, there were 3 from the Rapid Deployment Force and 2 from the Readiness Command that went down on that particular plane. I'm sure they must travel in this way. They weren't on vacation. They were on assignment from the military, and I don't know whether these particular 7 people were part of the conflict, but just this week there were long articles about the conflict of the branches of the service, and 7 people from the heart of this conflict were on that particular plane, and now we have Melvin Belli as their attorney. Incidentally, Air Florida put in a bid to buy Western Airlines before the crash took place, and evidently this has been approved, so they're not that broke. Maybe the lawsuits will stop them, or maybe they were allowed to buy so that if they overpay on the claims that Belli will try to get for each of these people, then they won't be able to follow through with their purchase on Western Airlines. I don't know what their cash is, but this week they were able to take over Western Airlines, and Pan Am and the older airlines are going broke. Now, there was some more mystery. I mentioned last week the paramedic Gene Windsor, who was told not to identify the man who was sinking. He was told don't cooperate with the news media or attempt to identify him by viewing photographs shown by news organizations. And I didn't understand why the Washington police were so insistent that a witness who saw a man sink into the water, this Arlen Williams, he thought it was told not to identify him. Well, there was another long article in the Washington Post, January the 20th. The plane crash hero remains a mystery, and it goes into the point of all the mysteries surrounding the crash of Air Florida jet. The most puzzling is the identity of the unknown passenger seen by the helicopter crew. And this article goes into why this mystery. Yesterday, the mystery only deepened, and they can't figure out. One gentleman who survived, the last person to get on the airplane, who worked for Fairchild, they had waited till he had boarded, just said, I didn't see such a passenger. He denied that this person was floating there in fell sunk into the frozen water. And another version accounted that it did in fact go that way and that they saw him. And another person confirmed 2 helicopter crews saw this person. And there's quite a bit of controversy. It's interesting. Joseph Staley worked for Fairchild. He survived. He was the last one on. And he said he was talking about this Mr. Williams and whether it was him or not that went sinking in the water, the man who helped 3 or 4 people first. And he said his main concern was to pass a lifeline to Priscilla Tirado. She was the one who should get out first as far as I was concerned. Now, Tirado was the one whose husband worked for George Bush. They'd recently come over from Madrid. And 1 month after he came from Madrid, he was working at masonry and so forth at the home of Vice President Bush. And Mr. Staley from Fairchild said the one that he was concerned was she was the one that should get out first. And there was still a lot of controversy up to the present about that particular person and why they didn't want him to be identified, or what was the objection to persons giving information of what they saw. Another article on the crash data, the little black box was retrieved. We were told as soon as they found that, they went diving for 3 days, we'd know all the secrets. And when they finally got the box, it didn't say anything. They went airborne, and the plane took off, and it was airborne less than 30 seconds, and that was the last that the air controllers ever heard of it. Francis McAdams, the National Transportation Safety Board, refused to speculate on the acceleration. There were too many problems. They don't know why it didn't accelerate, and they don't know why the takeoff didn't take place. They said in the San Francisco Examiner this week, we may never know the results. You know, we're told we'll know the results as soon as they play it back on the box, and then they say there's some things you may never know. It's like when they begin the investigation of who killed John Kennedy or the Watergate hearings, we'll have the whole truth so the country will be free and know the truth, and then they conclude by saying there's things you may never know. So the result of the National Transportation Board this week is we may never know. We sent the flight data to the Boeing company in Seattle, and when they return it to Federal Aviation, we will decide whether or not to release it. So evidently the plane just went off, and it wasn't long. Air Florida tapes, when they first were made public, there wasn't a word of the pilot. There wasn't a last word. There wasn't any cussing or anything. They were cleared for takeoff, and the tape was in good condition, and they yelled, the air controller said after 69 seconds, Palm 90, Air Florida. There was no answer. It didn't appear on the radar, and he waited for 4 minutes. Hey, guy. 4 minutes is a long time, 4 minutes and 20 seconds. There wasn't any trace, any sound, and then he told a pilot of a U.S. Airjet plane to go out there and look for 737, and the U.S. Army jet went to the end of the runway, and there was no sight of Flight 90. And by then, somebody was over at the Potomac. But there was no record. There was just dead silence. And usually on these tapes, the pilot will say, oh, remember when he cussed, or we're going down, and they make some comment, or you hear some noise. There was just total silence. It's interesting. They did autopsies on 74 victims. They didn't do more than 6 at Jonestown. There were over 900 dead. They claimed autopsies on 74 victims and said 57 died almost instantly, and some had injuries, and quite a few had injuries on the head. And there was a question, well, if they had on seat belts and they were only out 30 seconds, if they're held by the seat belts, how could their heads have been hurt? Even on impact, the plane didn't crash down on their heads. But they did autopsies on 74 for some reason or other that I can't figure out, and I think it's a little confusing. They also had trouble. One reason they didn't want to identify all the passengers, they identified one person as Spencer Hazelwood, and that was this person was brought up as Spencer Hazelwood, but he went under the name of a T. Pibbs. The ticket was to T. Pibbs, Pibbs, and actually it was Spencer Hazelwood who had used a ticket of somebody by another name, which was kind of interesting. There's a man in jail, if he's still alive, who hypnotized his best friend, and the plane put a bomb on a plane that blew up over the Gulf of Texas, or out in the water outside of New Orleans in the Bay, that area. And then this fella drove an old used car back to his wife in Texas, and she collected the insurance money, and then they found him, and he had put somebody on the plane going on his name, and he actually was safe on the ground. Well, the first passenger list said Mr. T. Pibbs died, but later that was Hazelwood, and so much for that. I did mention last week that Mr. Toronto, working as a cement mason at George Bush's house, and I think I mentioned to you before, but in case I didn't, I wanted to remind you that when Joseph Mengele was in this country, that's the Nazi doctor who experimented at Auschwitz, who lives down in Paraguay and comes frequently to the United States. According to the FBI report, he masquerades as a construction worker. So even Joseph Mengele does a little cement work on the side, and that's kind of interesting. Now, there was a lot of controversy. The United States Senate has asked the federal government to go into that other airplane, the World Airways. That crash that slid off the edge of the runway there in Boston, Massachusetts. There were several shocking things about that plane, and that was that as the jet plunged into the harbor, they insisted on the first day that all 208 people were safe, the DC-10. When they went off the runway, and this was January 24th, all 28 were safe, and they declared the next day everyone that was on the plane was safe. And then it took several days later, 3 days later, when they reported that 2 people were missing. And some witnesses saw a person hanging in the water about 25 feet away go under, and later there was hand luggage that was on the plane. And the Coast Guard, the shocking thing was an article in the Associated Press, January 29th, that the Coast Guard went under the airplane, and the Coast Guard men spotted a body in the wreckage in the forward section of the airplane, but they didn't bring it back up because the Coast Guard was told that all the passengers were there. Now, that is a little unbelievable to read an article over the wire service, is that the Coast Guard, no matter what they were told, you would think that they would bring the body up if they see a body in the water or want to know whose body. Here is a body in the plane, and they're told, no, everyone's accounted for, and they didn't bring the body up. And members of the family called World Airways and said that their father and brother were on that plane, and World Airways said, go to the police and file a missing persons report. And it took several days to admit that there are other witnesses who saw this. Donald Welsh, a dental student from Tufts University, recalled seeing the Metcalfs in the front row. The seat disappeared. He saw somebody floundering 25 feet to the left, and the person disappeared under the water. They told a firefighter. They told policemen. At the airport at the time of the crash, they called up World Airways a few days later. World Airways couldn't deny it because they found the luggage. And then finally, the government officials got a little tough, and the Massachusetts authority discovered after the luggage that they had to report who was on the plane. So they demanded that the airline, World Airlines, give them a list of who's on the plane. They wanted the passenger records of World Airlines. The Massachusetts lieutenant governor requested it immediately, asked for a congressional inquiry into this, and said, the Civil Aeronautics said by January 28th, you have to submit your flight coupons and your boarding passes by today, by January the 28th. Your boarding passes and your flight coupons. And so then they pulled out the boarding passes of the 2 men, Mr. Metcalf, who's 79 or 80, and his son, who's 40. They'd been in Florida, and they went to New Jersey and picked up this plane. The plane started in Oakland, California, to New Jersey to Boston. They went from Florida to New Jersey, and were going to pick it up and go to Boston, and they found that, admitted that Mr. Metcalf and their son were on the plane. Now, the important thing in this story is that after insisting that they had to submit those coupons, it took them 4 days to find the coupons that the men went through the boarding pass. Why did World Airways say they weren't there? Why did the Port Authority say everyone was accounted for? Why did the firemen and the police get involved in the cover-up? And then when they admitted that they had their passenger passes, they said that the computer wasn't working, that they were relying on the computer, and the 2 tickets of those 2 men weren't on the computer. Now, to match the computer not having those 2 passengers, having 208 people, but not having the passenger's name, and having those 2 people be the ones that are missing, the ones that weren't on the computer, the mathematical chances of that are really almost impossible. So the next question is, well, who is Mr. Metcalf or his son? Or were they drugged in New Jersey so that in case anything happened, they wouldn't be able to get out of it, or they would sink, or not be able to protect themselves? What were they doing in Miami? Who did they know in Miami? Who did they see in New Jersey? Why did they go this time of year? Why did World Airways wait 4 days? Every time you go through the gate to get on an airplane, you have to show your boarding pass when you go through the first door, when they open the door. You have to take your boarding pass and put it in the hands of the stewardess, and then she turns them over and the airplane door is closed. So it would only take about 10 minutes to go through those names, and if they could add them all up, then they had the names. Otherwise, they would have added 206. But what was World Airways covering here? Why did Boston Airport get involved in it? Why the local police and the fire department? And why didn't the Coast Guard bring up the body that was there that they saw? Just because they were told everyone was accounted for, they could have brought up that body at the time. And so therefore there must have been something there in that story that we'll have to wait much longer to find out about. Now, next week, I want to do a little more on Poland because we hear so much about solidarity and what's going on in Poland. I did do quite a bit. This was January the 3rd, 4 weeks ago. Poland this week is blaming the CIA for unrest in Poland. That's the gist of what I was talking about, the AFL-CIO, that is the CIA and the troublemakers in Poland forming the Solidarity in 1980. This week, there were pictures on the news. You probably saw them. They took in Poland pictures of people that worked for the American embassy, that were in the political section, that were working for CIA and other parts of the world before, and it showed their arrest, a particular woman, Leslie Sternberg, with brochures and secret ink and secret leaflets, and another person who worked at the American embassy, a residence where a stone was placed and messages under the stone. And then they pulled them out, and they had shaving brushes with microphones in them and all kinds of espionage, ink pellets, hollow shaving brushes, cameras, radios, and they were passing information inside of a stone that was picked up outside. Planted was information on Poland's air defense systems. So the newsreels showed the charges. The Poland blames the unrest on the CIA and how they not only are causing trouble, but photographing the installations. And I want to do more on the AFL-CIO. George Bush, January the 20th, this last week, accepted an invitation from the AFL-CIO Lane Kirkland to address their midwinter executive meeting in Bal Harbour, Florida. He's going to be part of the AFL-CIO meeting in February. This is Vice President Bush. He was in charge of the Polish desk with Richard Pipes and Walter Stessel and the entire Cold War team from the Eastern Division, the Galen men that worked so closely together. Again, there was a movie made on Poland by Mr. Charles Wick of the CIA, of the great communications, Radio Free Europe, and the American network. Ronald Reagan put on a show. This last week he used Frank Sinatra and Barbra Streisand, and then on the designated day, it was to be in conjunction with the AFL-CIO meeting in Chicago that Lane Kirkland set up. The movie production that Ronald Reagan made for $500,000 with the fellow who produces the Academy Awards, this outrageous piece of junk that's been criticized by our allies, this propaganda movie that was thrown over the satellites on Poland to make showbiz out of something that was and is very serious. This was arranged in conjunction with Mr. Kirkland of the AFL-CIO, and George Bush will be addressing them in February, so it's timely that I do an update on the Polish situation and the role of AFL-CIO in Guatemala, Nicaragua, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Chile, wherever labor tries to get organized, how they put in the fascist state, and the role I have done, as I say, broadcasts on the role that they have in setting up solidarity in Poland. Next week, hopefully, I'll get into their role, into the Marseille connections with the narcotic hoodlums and their links to the Red Brigade and the terror on the right. I'll do more on Dozier. I didn't bring him up before because the Red Brigade is so heavily tied into the extreme right-wing fascist group, and I believe that that giant hoax should be exposed, and hopefully I'll do more than that on that next week. But the FFL-CIO, George Bush, and Frank Sinatra and Charles Wick and the gang are pushing up the media show business thing on Poland, which doesn't solve the problems of the economy, the debt, the productivity, the road to go forward. They can't go forward with the Americans pumping money into their unrest. There's no solution to it, and there's no sensible effort to really make their system workable. We want the chaos so that we have the excuse to come in, and when we get there, we'll have more problems than we can imagine. Well, my time is up now. Once more, I have to say goodbye until next week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and I'll be back with you next week.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.
Tenakwe, hare mai. This is Neil Finn and
Tim Finn
from Split Ends on KLRB Carmel.